have to do this first. Welcome, everybody. Good morning to Silicon Valley. I welcome you today as a board member of the US-Japan Council, but also as a long-term denizen of this valley of silicon that we are sitting here in today. My life story is inextricably linked to Silicon Valley. I didn't think growing up in Okinawa that one day I would come across the seas and study under the palm trees here, nor that I would end up joining a company which was extremely small at the time with a funny-looking rainbow logo called Apple. Nor did I think that one day I would be reporting for most of my career to someone who will become iconic, not just in the Valley, but in the world, Steve Jobs. And never in a million years did I imagine that one day Apple would not just be making computers, but that we would be in the business of music, nor that I would be the one negotiating the agreements with the record labels to make that happen, and ending up with as much gray hair as I do now. Nor did I think we would be in the mobile phone business with iPhone. It has been one incredible journey, and today I'm really, really thrilled to have with me some friends who have been on that journey and along that path, and in many ways have shaped the Silicon Valley that we know today. We have a brief introduction, but we will go into their stories much more as the panel gets going. Rochelle King. She is the Global VP of Design and Insights at Spotify, and previous to that was at Netflix and ran data and design there. And she's also on the board of the Center for Justice and Accountability and New York City's Tech Talent Pipeline. Hans-Peter Brøndmo is currently the GM of robots at X. Many of you know this as Google X in its prior naming. And he is a serial entrepreneur. That word gets thrown around quite a bit, but he is truly one of those, having started 5 companies and sold 3 of them, and now having a huge part in Google's most advanced research efforts. I mean, he's got things on his resume. I had to write this down because I can't remember it. Worked on early Macintosh-based object-oriented control systems and novel user interfaces for the proton cyclotron high-energy particle accelerator. I wish I had had that. And finally, we have Bryan Meehan, who is the CEO of Blue Bottle Coffee. And they're just opening up a store in Shinagawa. As we speak, almost. And incredible to have that iconic brand and the head of that effort. I'm really super excited, actually, about this panel for a couple of reasons. One is that, I mean, this is about as Silicon Valley as you can get, I think. A couple of weeks ago, I was preparing for this panel. I was sitting in my living room. I had my MacBook on my lap, trying to get ready for it. I was doing my research, where else but in a Google search bar. I had my music, background music, playing on Spotify as I was listening to my daily mix, and I was sipping on a hot cup of Blue Bottle coffee that I just poured for myself. So this, to me, is Silicon Valley and all that it represents. The other reason I'm very, very excited about it is that all of these people have a tie to Japan, which we will get into. So through their stories and their journeys, I want to explore what is it that makes Silicon Valley, and the importance of Silicon Valley and its ties to Japan. And Hans-Peter, I wanted to get started with you because actually we go back the furthest, and we've known each other the longest. And it might have been almost 30 years ago, maybe, I think. Hans-Peter actually came.
I was 4 years old.
Yeah. Helped me come start up Apple Japan at the time and work with me there. And your title at the time was hyperactivist and software engineer because you were working on HyperCard. But why don't you, tell us about that journey of starting with working together in Apple Japan, but the many kind of companies that you've started and how you ended up where you are today.
Yeah, thank you, James, and it's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me. I just want to take 1 minute to reflect on those days in Japan, actually, because working at Apple, of course, was very exciting back then. We were a small team. We were almost like a little startup over in Japan. But what stuck with me and has stuck with me the most is actually the incredible kindness and generosity that I experienced in Japan. I was a young guy. I just graduated from college here in the U.S. and I grew up in Norway. And I lived in the U.S. I'd lived in Norway, but I'd never lived in Asia, and I'd never had experience with Japan before. And I had an incredible experience, and I think in many ways it shaped an important part of my outlook for the rest of my life. Partly, that outlook was shaped by the fact that I just didn't understand Japan. It was so different. People thought about things so differently, and it humbled me to be in an environment where there was an enormous amount of humanity, generosity, kindness, but also such a different approach to thinking about problems from the way I had been taught to think about problems. And this actually taught me a very important lesson going forward, which we can get back into as we progress. So I grew up in Norway. I spent the last year before I came to the US 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle, where I was trained in guerrilla warfare. This was in the Cold War in the Norwegian military. And then I came to Boston. It was the first time I'd ever lived in a city. I was in Boston at MIT and computer science. And then ended up living from Boston. I was in Geneva working on the proton synchrotron. I went back to Boston. I went to Japan. I lived in Japan. I've been back to Boston, lived in Norway for a little bit again, and then back to Boston, and then Silicon Valley for the last 20 years, Berlin for 2 years, and then again, primarily been out here. So my outlook is primarily shaped by sort of a set of global experiences that, if anything, has been defined by sort of a diverse set of inputs and stimuli. And again, I think Japan was a very early and important influence. Now, as far as the sort of the professional endeavors I've pursued, I have one headline for all of them as I reflect on them now and look back, and it's adventure. I think my life I've been incredibly fortunate in that I've had a series of unbelievable adventures. Some of them, again, have been living in different places and experiencing different types of people and thinking, but also through my professional experiences, doing startups in a variety of different areas. And no one of them has been the same. And I think what's particularly unique to me has been, what I've really cherished, and I think what's particularly unique here in the Valley, is that experience isn't necessarily because you're a domain expert in some area. Experience is because you've sampled a lot of different things. Experience comes from a deeper understanding and broader understanding of how to approach complex and big problems. So my background has ranged, and I won't go through it all here, but my background has ranged a number of different domains and experience areas, and most recently leading me to X, where I'm very fortunate to be now.
I want to touch on X a little bit, because I think one of the defining kind of characteristics of the Valley is ambition, almost the audacity of ambition in the types of things that we want to tackle and trying to change the world. And essentially that's what X does. You try to tackle big problems that affect not millions, but billions of people. I mean, how do you kind of think about that, and what is the process? What are the types of things you think about in this ambition that the Valley has?
Yeah, X is a very unique place, and I kick myself every day when I get to go to work at a moonshot factory. It's a remarkable environment. And I think there are a few things that characterize it in particular, and I'll mention those briefly because I think they're important. One is that X is very much, it's not sort of a bunch of money thrown over the fence by some, a successful company to say, oh, let's go play in some research areas. It's really a strong focus and emphasis on having impact, on having global impact, and impact for good. And it's very much, Larry and Sergey are very hands-on involved. Larry pulls me out of the line in the cafeteria frequently. Sergey primarily pulls me out of the line and tells me why I'm doing something wrong or mostly or right. they are very engaged and involved. So the founder culture is still very much a part of what defines us, at X. And the way we talk about how we're a moonshot factory. The way we define moonshots is very simple. Just like you saw the 3 Microsoft circles, we have 3 circles as well. And our first circle is we want to address huge problems. These are problems that, if solved, can positively impact, as James just said, billions of people. We want to approach them with radical solutions. So the second circle is a radical solution, which means not the way you've traditionally thought about things, but radical new ways of thinking about things. And the third is breakthrough technology. So at the intersection of huge problem, radical solution, and breakthrough technology is where we define our moonshots. And then, of course, it requires patient capital, it requires long-term thinking, it requires very kind of audacious thinking at times. But what I've come to recognize and realize in the year I've spent now at X is that what's as important as all of the sort of infrastructure advantages and everything else that we can bring to the table is what we call moonshot thinking. And moonshot thinking is about falling in love with the problem, not the solution. It's about thinking 10x, not 1x. So we have this little thing we talk about, moonshots versus roof shots. So if you build a really cool ladder, maybe it's even a robotic ladder, and it has suction cups on it, and it helps you get to every roof in the world. You've actually technically achieved something amazing. You've gotten closer to the moon by reaching to the top of every rooftop. But it hasn't helped you get to the moon at all. So thinking about how to get to the top of a building might technically get you closer to the moon, but it didn't get you there. You have to sort of step back and you have to think completely differently about the problem. And that's what we have the fortune to do and what we're able to do. And so this idea of falling in love with the problem and staying very intellectually honest around the problem and not getting too attached to any solution is a very big part of how we think about things and how we think about moonshots, and what kind of, I think, invigorates people to stay in this exploratory mode and come up with really radically different approaches and different solutions.
Yeah, for the audience, can you give us a couple examples of things that are moonshots too?
Yeah, so you might have heard of Loon, for example. Loon is based on the realization that more than 3 billion people on the planet still don't have reliable internet access. And so what we decided to do was we sort of said, well, what's a radical sort of solution to that problem? How about if we fly balloons at 20,000 meters, and the balloons are all interconnected in a mesh network, and then can basically beam internet access down to the underlying population? Well, it turns out that balloons, you can't really power them with motors. So all they can do is go up and down. And so you have these balloons flying at 20,000 meters, 60,000 feet, above commercial airline traffic, but below satellites. And the way we navigate them is we move them up and down into various sort of airstreams, and to the jet streams. But it turns out that the jet streams are unpredictable. At least we didn't have proper weather patterns. So not only have we had to figure out how to navigate balloons up and down, which is a relatively low energy problem, and you can do fairly easily, and then make them connect to each other with incredible precision in order to move data back and forth and then ultimately down to the ground. We've also had to figure out how to keep these balloons in stationary patterns over the markets and areas that we wanted to address. So this is an incredibly complex and large problem space. Another one, of course, that everybody here is familiar with is the self-driving car. And there again, we consider it kind of to get a car to drive between, lane following on a freeway is essentially a PhD thesis these days. It's not a particularly difficult problem anymore. Getting cars to drive around a small town with people out walking with their children, doors suddenly opening on cars, bicyclists, this turns out to be a moonshot problem. This is 10x more difficult than driving a car on a freeway. So these are the kinds of big problems that we are attempting to solve, and that we've made some sort of exciting breakthroughs and progress on already.
So Bryan, our Japan connection is working together to open up and launch Blue Bottle in Japan. And I also wanted to explore this notion of Silicon Valley is also about ecosystems. It's not just about ideas. It's also about the venture capital that's around. It's also about the lawyers. It's about all these things that support companies, even companies that are coffee companies, not necessarily tech companies, even though I consider Blue Bottle very high tech. in many ways. But could you tell us a little bit about kind of, one, the origins of Blue Bottle and the ties to the Kisaten culture in Japan, one, and then using that to kind of step us through what the fundraising and the rounds and what that ecosystem of funding was able to do for you.
Ohayou gozaimasu. Yeah, I was actually asked outside, someone who didn't know about Blue Bottle in Japan, was our coffee American or European? And actually, no one's asked me that question for a long time. And I had to think about it, and I said, first of all, I said, we're Blue Bottle. We're definitely not European style, but I also don't think we're American style. If anything, we're Japanese style. And the reason I would say that is because as a company, Blue Bottle, even though we only opened in Kiyosumi in Tokyo 18 months ago, we've been so heavily influenced by Japanese culture ever since our founder, James Freeman, founded the company, over 12 years ago. So a lot of what you see, I've got a can of Blue Bottle here, which we're going to sample afterwards. But when you see, walk into a Blue Bottle store here or in Japan, is heavily influenced by what James calls the Kisaten culture. Not that we do Kisaten coffee, but we acknowledge the technique and we acknowledge the precision and the purity of Kisaten. And we feel that in some ways in coffee culture in Europe and in America, we've lost our ways where we're adding in vanilla spice and low-fat milk and extra hot and so many different variations. When you walk into Kisaten and you say, I would like this coffee off the menu, there's no additions to it. It's purity. It's made with such precision, and that's what really influences Blue Bottle. Do you want me to talk about?
Well, and then James.
So James Freeman is the founder of Blue Bottle. He's actually, he calls himself, a coffee geek and nerd. He was actually started as a clarinet player, a disgruntled clarinet player, and feeling that career was not really meant for him to be in. He started roasting coffee in his kitchen, and then leased a 100 square foot room in Oakland and started selling coffee in the farmers markets. This is going back 12 years ago. And he just found that a lot of people he didn't set the company up to create a global empire or be the next Starbucks or anything. He set it up because he just enjoys coffee and he loves design and he loves doing things in a perfect way. And it was just the response he got in the farmers markets led him then to open a store in Linden Street in Hayes Valley, which has become a famous store. It's got as high sales per square foot as Apple. And it's this tiny little, again, 200 square foot kiosk in Linden Street, which I think on the Japanese tours of San Francisco, the bus actually stops at Linden Street. And so that store I think took $70 on its first day, and then $100, and again there was no ambition in it in terms of James just said he just wanted a place to serve great coffee, and he only opened in that alleyway because he didn't have enough money to open where normal retailers would open. But then people acknowledged and sought out his coffee. He opened in the Ferry Building and then in Mint Plaza. I got involved in the company about 5 years ago. My background's in organic food and retailing and skincare. And I came over here from London. I'm actually Irish. But I came over here, my wife and my family were living in London, discovered Blue Bottle Coffee, was just fascinated by how quiet the brand was and how precise it was that I approached James and asked him, would he be interested in partnering with me? And, that I thought that this business had a lot more to offer the world than what we were doing right now. And then James told me about his love of Japan, and we went over to Tokyo about 4 years ago and visited. And what I couldn't believe when I went to Tokyo is how many people knew about Blue Bottle Coffee. It was, I go to the Staya bookstore and I open up magazines, and there's so many articles about Blue Bottle Coffee that I hadn't realized how big the brand was in Tokyo. Then I'd arrive in a cafe with my Blue Bottle badge here, and the baristas would just go, Blue Bottle Coffee. And this is before we were even there. And at that point, I knew that Blue Bottle Coffee belonged in Tokyo. It's not that we could be successful in Tokyo. We belong in Tokyo. We belong in Japan.
But how do you go from somebody's garage and 200 square feet to like getting investors on board or raising money because you want to do this expansion? Walk us through kind of what the funding rounds and investors were like.
So Mike Volpe, who's fluent in Japanese, works with James at Index Ventures. He was my next door neighbor in London. So when I lived in London, Mike and I were great friends. And then so he moved back to the States. I moved to the States, came across Blue Bottle, needed some money to invest in the business. Who do I call? Mike Volpe, Danny Reimer, James Higa, and Index participated in that round. Another company called True Ventures participated. Again, at that stage, the company was tiny, and the round of financing was not huge. But we spent the first year sort of building the management team, building systems of how we could make this a professional business. And then 2 years after that, we raised about $26 million from Morgan Stanley. And then a year later, $75 million, which is led by Fidelity. So in the space of 3 years, we'd gone from this humble, small business to a company that Fidelity was putting in their blue chip high growth fund, which I just can't believe that we're in the Fidelity blue chip high growth fund. But we are, and we're this humble coffee company in San Francisco.
So all told, over $100 million.
Over $100 million so far have been raised.
For a coffee company. I mean, that's what the ecosystem, I think, does for you. I want to turn to Rochelle. In your Japanese connection, well, there's kind of two, I guess, as we're fellow Uchinanchus, Okinawans.
That's right.
So for all the Okinawans in the room, yay. And she's a Punahou grad, and I know there's a big Hawaii contingent, so she's doing Hawaii proud here. But now you're at Spotify, so walk us through the journey. How do you get from the sandy beaches and plate lunches of Honolulu to Stockholm?
So I think growing up in Hawaii is awesome because it's such a beautiful place. And in a lot of ways, because it's a tourist destination, it kind of feels like the world is coming to you. But I think that one of the things that you're aware of when you grow up in Hawaii is that it can also be very insular sometimes and isolating in a very strange way. And so I think when you were talking about the diversity of experiences and seeking that out, my diversity of experiences pales in comparison to yours, I think. But when I graduated from Punahou, I wanted to go to some place as different as possible from what I was experiencing in Hawaii. And so I went to Cornell, which is in upstate New York and really quite cold. I actually studied art history there and then came back to the West Coast where I went to Stanford for graduate school in civil engineering and material science and engineering. So clearly at the time, the wrong kind of engineering because it wasn't computer science. But I was there from 92 to 95. And I think that was a really critical period in time. It was before the internet got its boom, but so many of the people who were studying at Stanford at that time went on to create a lot of the first generation of businesses in the internet. So there's clearly something in the water there that made a lot of us very open-minded to leveraging new technologies and thinking about those things. I worked as a structural engineer for a few years. I actually worked in semiconductors just down the street on Bowers Avenue at Applied Materials in a bunny suit, laying down different kinds of metals on silicon wafers. And then that was at the time, late 90s, when the internet was just getting started, and really you could get a job in the internet without having any background in it or any domain expertise, because that's, again, what the environment supported. So I worked at a company for a number of years. We were acquired by Intuit and eventually made my way to Netflix, where I didn't actually manage data and design there, but did design, content operations, and a number of other things there as well. For me, that was really formative because it was the time when I saw that company transform from DVD by mail into a streaming business. It was when Netflix actually went international for the first time, and it was also at the very beginning of the original content, which was just really exciting to be part of and to witness that kind of transformation happening. And then I actually ended up in Stockholm for very personal reasons. I had never lived abroad. I have never had the experience of working in a truly global company, and Spotify is actually based in Sweden. And so took the opportunity with my family at the right age to move to Stockholm and set up there and lead the team at Spotify. And spent about 4 years there, and just a couple months ago have moved back now to the States. And I'm based out of New York, which is where their U.S. corporate headquarters is.
Yeah, I want to dive into design a little bit because I also think Silicon Valley is about design. And it used to be people talked about kind of hardware and software. And certainly Apple was there as one of the prime movers of making design such an important part of the product and the success equation. But I now think of Silicon Valley not just hardware and software, but it's hardware and software and design and data. And could you speak a little bit about the role of design in places like Spotify and data?
Yeah. So I think that when I think about data and design coming together, there's really two ways that we leverage that. Both something that I saw very strongly at Netflix, but also at Spotify. You can combine data and design both in the decision-making process of deciding what to build. And so definitely we leverage a lot of tools like A/B testing, where we're putting out two different experiences to the public and seeing which one actually works best, and then measure the data coming back to us from the customers to decide what we should actually do next, right? So that's leveraging both data and design in the decision-making process. The other way that we see data and design coming together a lot lately is that there's more and more reliance on things like recommendation engines, on personalization algorithms, and all of those sorts of things, where we're really taking the data, and then it becomes the role of design to take something that is invisible and make it visible to the consumer. Right? And I think it's through the design that we try to express what the value of those algorithms are in the experience for our customers. And those are the two ways that I really see data and design working together.
But I love how you go about it because, I mean, you look at the quantitative data for sure, but,
Yeah.
You approach the question from more of a very simple, what do we need to do to get people to listen to music? I mean,
Right. Yeah. So I think one of the things that you're alluding to is that in the past, not so much now, but in the past, people always saw data and design as somewhat opposing forces because data seems so numerical and cold and dehumanizing, and design is this creative thing that's emotional. If we take it to the extremes or take those stereotypes, that's what people often think. But I really see that those are two complementary skills or two complementary things, and that they are actually moving in the same direction. And so one of the ways that I often think about challenging my teams is to say, remember that behind every single point of data is a real human, right? That data is actually measuring human behavior, and that's their language and the thing that they use to communicate back to us about whether or not what we're doing is working for them or not. And so sometimes we can get caught up in driving towards these metrics like DAU, MAU, daily active users, monthly active users. And instead of just saying, what are we doing to increase daily active users, we should be talking about the behavior that underlies those metrics and say, what can we do to change that? So instead of saying, let's increase daily active users, we say, hey, what can we do to get people to play more music, right? And then we start to talk about, what ultimately becomes measured in data, but in a very human way.
Another thing I think Silicon Valley is global, right, from the onset. And Blue Bottle is an amazing example of this. When we were first talking about Japan, the common wisdom, and maybe wisdom today, is just go do a joint venture. And Blue Bottle decided not to do that and decided to spend its own money, build its own stores, and go into Japan that way. So tell us a little bit about the thinking there.
Well, I mean, at Blue Bottle, we love to control the experience. And so I know a lot of companies, when you expand into Japan, you do a joint venture. And we were approached by some of the best companies in Japan, and it was very tempting. But we reckoned that if we had done that, Blue Bottle in Japan would be a different Blue Bottle to the Blue Bottle in the US. So it was all about keeping control. On the downside, we're going to grow slower in Japan, but on the upside, it's so precise what we do in Japan. In North America, we're actually learning from the Japanese. Our Japanese stores are probably our best stores in the world. And I don't think that was going to happen if we did a joint venture. Maybe it was, but that was the risk. I just went to at the time we were raising money from Morgan Stanley, and I said, I think it's going to take us $5 million to open in Japan. Build our roastery, get set up, open 3 or 4 stores. And so I would much rather bet $5 million, and if it's not a success, we move on. As it turned out, I think our initial investment was $3 million, and when we opened we put something on the web in our that we were recruiting, I think, 40 people in Kiyosume to start off with, and the next morning 800 baristas showed up with their resumes, personally handing our resumes to the front door of Kiyosume, which is obviously a Japanese tradition. We were just overwhelmed, and at that point I knew that we had made the right decision to do it ourselves.
Yeah, and when I visited the Kiyosume store and kind of wandered around the neighborhood and had a little bit of coffee to drink and beer afterwards, I remember walking into the beer place, and Blue Bottle had passed out tenugui towels, the long towels, when you opened and launched there. And this little mom and pop beer place was so proud of that they actually had it framed and on the wall. I mean, I can't think of another American company that has come into Japan where it's and that kind of love for the brand. And they call it, was it the Kiyosume Blue?
The blue bubble, yeah.
The Blue Bottle Bubble.
The blue bottle
right?
bubble, yeah. They
and
call
having
it blue
transformed
bubble.
the entire neighborhood.
Yeah, so our general manager in Japan is not American; she's Japanese, Saki Igawa, and she came to help us with PR, and then very quickly we promoted her literally within months to heading up the whole Japanese operation. And again, we relied on her, and in the same sort of way as a joint venture, we relied on her to. She felt that we needed to get deep into the community, and we went around and knocked on every single business in Kiyosume, because there was a worry in Kiyosume that this big company was coming, and there was always a nervousness about who are these people. And so we literally just went around and introduced ourselves and then gave them a gift. And then the first thing we did before we opened our store was to invite everyone from that community for 2 days of events. And then on the day we opened in Kiyosume, I think there was a 3-hour line outside the door, and so many flowers. I'd never seen so many bouquets of flowers with well wishes from the Japanese business community and local community. It was phenomenal.
And how many stores in Japan now?
So we've now 5 stores. We opened in Aoyama, and then recently we opened in Roppongi, Nakameguro, and then this afternoon we're opening in Shinagawa Station, right about where almost like millions of people walking by on a daily basis. So we're upstairs as you walk through Shinagawa, and then we also opened in Shinjuku Station as well. So 5 stores.
I mean, for me, the instructive part about that story is that from day one, Blue Bottle's ambition has been to go global. And remember, they had their, in many ways, inspiration from Japanese kisoten culture. And so the question I always ask is, why wasn't it a Japanese company that is taking coffee global? Why is it Blue Bottle?
We are a Japanese company
that's doing that. Yes,
said we're a Japanese
right.
company.
But I think the sense of global kind of ambition is inherent in many of the companies here, and certainly with a lot of Japanese companies I work with, or European companies I work with. My biggest piece of advice to startups is just add 2 more zeros to that business plan. You aren't thinking global. You aren't being ambitious. Another really important characteristic of the Valley is this notion of that it's generational. It's you have joined a company like a Facebook or a Google or an Apple or a startup, and you have much success. You spin out and you go out and start a company. You mentor those who come behind you. And so there's this generational aspect to it. Now, you've started a lot of companies, so I think you've been in both the startup role as well as the mentoring role for the generation that follows behind. At Index, I created a position called the mentor in residence, because even Steve Jobs and I were mentored by folks like Andy Grove at Intel and people like Morita at Sony when we were 20-something and we didn't know what the hell we were doing. And we could ask really stupid questions like, I really don't understand how to run a staff meeting. Could you help me? I mean, could you speak a little bit about your journey and what that kind of generational mentorship dynamics have been like and have helped you?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. And I think if there's maybe anything that makes Silicon Valley what Silicon Valley is today, it's the network of mentors and the knowledge and wisdom kind of imbued in that network. I think of a mentor as sort of a somewhere between a master craftsman and a kind of a sage, wise person. And so it's our mentors here in the Valley are our proverbial village elders, right? We are now village elders, James, whether we like it or not. And I think that that idea of village elders or of master craftsmen is, of course, not anything that we have a monopoly on here in Silicon Valley, but our word for it, I think, has become mentor. And what I also think Silicon Valley has is an interesting counterpart to that, which is this healthy disrespect for authority and disrespect for and celebration of sort of the young person who comes in at 21 years old and has some crazy idea that the majority of people around them, including all their mentors, says is crazy, and they stick with it anyway, and they make it happen, and all of a sudden they're, the next big thing. Facebook might come to mind. So you have these, incredible people who have a strong sense of vision, but almost always the really successful one and the smart ones will surround themselves with advisors, mentors. And so I think it's a really interesting, in a sense, sort of secret weapon that Silicon Valley has. I think Stanford could go away and not too much would happen, but I think if the mentor network went away, I think Silicon Valley would actually significantly sort of suffer, because that's where the institutional knowledge exists. When my better half, Julie, started a company in 2001, she came to me one day and she said, Hans-Peter, I feel like she was negotiating with her venture capitalists and for a big term sheet. She said, I feel like I'm playing this game where they know the rules, but I don't. And what mentors do is they help you understand the rules, help you understand the lay of the land. So even if you're willing to break all the rules, they sort of say, look, these you can't really get around, or these you might actually want to respect. And so they kind of help you paint the landscape and obviously guide you forward. And so having those mentor networks, I think, is one of our, and the multi-generational ones, I think, is one of our key advantages here.
Lastly, I want to explore this notion that Silicon Valley is about diversity. And Rochelle, I mean, if you were in Japan, you would be like the thinnest, rarest exception. Right? You're a woman. You're a global VP of a company that's a major global brand. So I was hoping maybe to both the businessmen in the audience who might be here from Japan, and we have a lot of young ELP women as well, speak to them about kind of the importance of the role of both women and diversity and what that's been like in your journey.
Yeah, I think one of the things is at the most basic level, right? I think including being open-minded to including people from different backgrounds just opens up the workforce that you're exposing yourself to. But that, like I said, is the most basic level. I think beyond that, as James was saying earlier, so many companies aspire to be global. So many companies aspire to find new audiences in areas where you may not currently be reaching them. And in order to do that, it actually becomes even more important to make sure that you're bringing in those perspectives and people who have different experiences than the ones that you have if you were to only be recruiting people who look and have the same experiences as you. I think that's, think about all of the ideas that you're missing out on because people who do have different experiences and different perspectives, whether it's gender, ethnicity, country, age, any of those things, you're missing out on a ton of ideas if you're not bringing in those kinds of people with those sorts of backgrounds into the company. So I think that's really important. You told me a great story that I'm going to turn it back to you about opening up the offices in Japan for Apple. I thought it was really interesting for a number of reasons, but.
Yeah, I think when I was first starting Apple Japan, I couldn't recruit, and it was difficult. I'd have to go talk to parents. I'd have to jump on the train to the countryside and go talk to grandparents and sit down and have ocha with them and say, yeah, I know it's a funny looking logo and rainbow and all. It really is a legitimate company. I think your son would be really well served to join this, and I would always get back, no, Sony, no, IBM Japan, no, NEC, no, Fujitsu. And it just got to be too hard, and I wasn't making any progress at all. So I basically decided, let's try something else. And so I went after women who were working at the NECs and the Fujitsus and the Sonys and IBM Japans, and basically went to them and said, hey, do you want to serve tea and translate letters into English for the rest of your life, or do you really want a real project and be a project manager? Because I will give you that. And so most of the majority of women in my group at Apple Japan in those early years were actually the best women, and they were the ones that I could recruit. And you work with these women, Hans Peter.
Yeah. So I loved that story because, one, it kind of shows, yeah. When James told me that story, I was like, have you ever told that story before? And he's like, no. I'm like, how could you not tell such a great story more publicly? But I think the reason that it really resonated with me is because it actually showed how sometimes people who think that they're in that outsider status, actually we are much more open to take risks that other people may not be willing to do because they're too tied to the structure or the system or the safety net that you think exists. So when you're an outsider, like being a woman in Japan during that time, you are actually able to take bigger risks, but also probably have bigger rewards and more opportunity than many of the male counterparts. So I think that was really interesting to me. Also just very clever to think about how you can open up the workforce to so many different kinds of folks. And probably, I'm sure that office had a different culture or different insights and things like that because of the people that were working there. So I love that story so much.
Can I also just
Yeah.
sort of triple down on that? I think diversity is the most important thing to unlocking innovation. I think that we speak a lot about cognitive diversity at X and creating sort of and instead of focusing in on this percentage of men and this percentage of women and this percentage of this sort of racial, ethnic background, you think about the fact that if you want to approach a problem with a real sort of cognitive dissonance around the table, so people having different perspectives that come together to really, as I said, fall in love with the problem and really explore the problem deeply, you have to have an inclusive set of experiences. And those come from having different life experiences which come from different genders and different nationalities, etc. So important.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. So I think that the cognitive diversity is probably the most important things. And then ethnicity, socioeconomic background, gender are proxies for how you attract and identify folks that will actually bring in those different perspectives. And that actually has to be the ultimate goal, not just checking the box on a quota, for having gotten different kinds of folks. Because if they all graduated from Harvard Business School and so forth, it may not be that much of a cognitive dissonance.
Well, and also I think pragmatically, for me, it makes no sense to leave half your talent pool on the sidelines. I mean, how's that good for business? But I think it's emblematic of the panel that you're looking at. What do we have here? We have an Irishman, we have a Norwegian, we have a Hawaiian, Japanese American, and an Okinawan. So, I mean, this is diversity that is Silicon Valley, and hugely important. So let's kind of review kind of the themes that we've been talking about today through our panelists. I think one is ambition. Silicon Valley is ambition and the audacity of the moonshot ambition. I think Silicon Valley is the ecosystem, is vastly important. Even companies like Blue Bottle and many others were able to raise over $100 million and get all the support that we need in finance and legal and mentorship, etc. Silicon Valley is not just about hardware and software anymore. It's about hardware, software, design, data, and increasingly it will be about machine learning and AI as an example. So much more nuanced, much more complex. The hurdles to innovation are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Silicon Valley is about the global mindset. We automatically think global. We want to go global. We want to be billion-dollar companies. We always add the 2 zeros to that business plan right from the get-go. Silicon Valley is about mentorship and generational. It is a lot about both being helped by the people who have gone before you, but when you are there, helping the people coming behind you for that success. And that generational cycle of success is very, very important. And we see pockets of that happening in places like London and Berlin and Tel Aviv and Stockholm and Helsinki, et cetera, but they haven't had the turns of generations yet that we've seen in Silicon Valley. And finally, ending on diversity and how important that is. So I want to thank the panel, but before I do that, Blue Bottle, in its imitable way of omotenashi or hospitality, Bryan has something that he would like to tell all of us.
I think we have our cold brew cans and our New Orleans iced coffee outside, or somewhere, maybe inside here, at the back of the room, maybe. Yeah, just at the back of the room. So hope you can enjoy our product, and thank you so much for everything you guys do for Blue Bottle.
And I would mention, for those of you who are from Japan, both the Blue Bottle cold brew and the New Orleans iced are not available in Japan. And for those of you who are here from the States who don't have Blue Bottle stores, this will be a real treat. So thank you again to Bryan, Hans-Peter, Rochelle on telling us about your Silicon Valley experiences.